Hello everyone, my name is Dalton Jenkins and I'm going to be giving a lecture I've prepared on chapter 55 of our textbook titled Ecosystems and Restoration Ecology. First we'll talk about physical laws, energy flow, and chemical recycling, starting with energy flow and chemical recycling. Ecosystems require a constant incoming supply of energy. This usually takes the form of light from the sun in order to continue functioning. Additionally, energy has a one-way path through an ecosystem, whereas chemicals can be recycled and reused within an ecosystem. Chemicals fluctuate between the biotic and abiotic factors found within an ecosystem, and primary producers, including both photosynthetic and chemosynthetic organisms, absorb chemicals from abiotic factors and convert them into organic compounds. Furthermore, these organic compounds are returned to inorganic form by decomposers or by the metabolic processes of the animals that consume them. Moving on to the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be destroyed or created, but it can be converted. For example, plants convert energy obtained from sunlight into chemical energy. As mentioned before, all energy that enters an ecosystem will eventually be lost as heat and will exit the ecosystem. Thus, there is a need for a constant incoming supply of energy for an ecosystem to go on existing. Next, we'll talk about the law of conservation of mass. Like energy, mass cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be converted. For example, plants and chemosynthetic organisms convert chemicals obtained from abiotic factors in inorganic forms into parts of organic compounds, and decomposers return them back to their inorganic forms. Unlike energy, chemicals do not always eventually exit an ecosystem, but they go through a recycling process. However, new chemical mass can enter an ecosystem in various forms, such as dust, and chemical mass can be lost through multiple means as well, such as chemicals returning to the atmosphere in a gaseous form. Finally, on this slide, we'll talk about trophic levels. Organisms within ecosystems are organized into trophic levels based on their feeding relationships with other organisms also found within the ecosystem. The first trophic level we'll talk about are the primary producers. Primary producers are the autotrophic organisms, which can be either photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, that use energy and inorganic compounds to produce organic compounds for food and fuel. Next are the primary consumers. The heterotrophic primary consumers are organisms that derive their nutrition by feeding directly on primary producers. For example, herbivores that feed on plants are primary consumers. Next are the secondary consumers. The heterotrophic secondary consumers are organisms that derive their nutrition by feeding on primary consumers. For example, carnivorous predators that eat herbivorous animals are secondary consumers. Next, we have the tertiary consumers. The heterotrophic tertiary consumers are organisms that derive their nutrition by feeding on secondary consumers. For example, carnivorous predators that feed on other carnivores are tertiary consumers. And finally, we have decomposers. The heterotrophic decomposers are organisms that feed on non-living organic materials, which is known as detritus, which can be in various forms, including fecal matter and the remains of dead organisms. Additionally, most decomposers are fungi and prokaryotic organisms. Decomposers are also responsible for a critical amount of chemical recycling that takes place within an ecosystem. This diagram features an overview of energy and nutrient dynamics in an ecosystem. Energy enters the ecosystem as light from the sun. Primary producers use this energy to create organic materials. Primary consumers feed on primary producers. Secondary and tertiary consumers feed on primary consumers. And when all of these organisms die, they return to detritus, which is broken down by decomposers. And you can see the orange arrows represent energy and how it flows through this web. And most of the energy ends up being lost as heat, whereas the blue arrows represent nutrients and chemicals that continue to flow through the ecosystem. Next, we'll talk about limiting factors of primary production, starting by discussing ecosystem energy budgets and specifically the global energy budget. Earth's atmosphere comes into contact with a massive amount of solar energy each day, However, only a tiny fraction of this energy is used in photosynthesis by primary producers. About half of the total daily solar energy that Earth's atmosphere comes into contact with is lost in the atmosphere through various means, and only a small fraction of that energy actually makes it to Earth's surface. And only a small fraction of the energy that makes it to Earth's surface comes into contact with photosynthetic organisms. And only 1% of this already small fraction of energy is absorbed and used by photosynthetic organisms. However, despite this, around 150 billion metric tons of organic materials are produced by primary producers annually. Next, we'll talk about gross and net production. Starting with gross primary production. The term gross primary production is concerned with the total amount of energy that an ecosystem's primary producers produce without subtracting the amount of energy that the primary producers use themselves. Next, we have net primary production. The term net primary production is concerned with the total amount of energy that an ecosystem's primary producers produce and store as organic materials. Furthermore, this total can be found by subtracting the amount of energy used by the primary producers from the ecosystem's gross primary production. And finally, we have net ecosystem production. Whereas net primary production can be found by subtracting the total amount of energy used by primary producers only from an ecosystem's gross primary production, an ecosystem's net ecosystem production can be found by subtracting the total amount of energy used by all organisms, producers, and consumers within an ecosystem from that ecosystem's gross primary production. Let's move on to discuss primary production in aquatic environments. Start by talking about light limitation. The amount of solar energy that reaches photosynthetic organisms limits their production of energy in the form of organic materials. This is no different in aquatic ecosystems, and in general, only the photic zone of an aquatic environment receives enough solar energy for photosynthesis to occur. Next, we'll talk about nutrient limitation. While the availability of solar energy does limit primary production in aquatic environments, the availability of nutrients is the primary limiting factor of primary production within these environments. Furthermore, the critical nutrient whose availability is responsible for limiting an ecosystem's primary production is referred to as the limiting nutrient, and the limiting nutrient must be introduced in more significant quantities for an ecosystem's primary production to increase. The term eutrophication refers to the processes by which an ecosystem's nutrient availability dramatically shifts in a nutrient-rich direction as a result of some event. Furthermore, eutrophication can have negative consequences for an ecosystem. For example, it can create the conditions that make an algal bloom possible. Moving on to primary production in terrestrial environments, first we'll talk about the primary limiting factors of primary production in terrestrial ecosystems. Whereas the availability of light and nutrients are the primary limiting factors of primary production in aquatic environments, primary production in terrestrial ecosystems is mainly limited by temperature and moisture. Primary production is highest in terrestrial ecosystems that are both warm and moist, such as tropical rainforests, and is lowest in terrestrial ecosystems that experience a temperature extreme, either very hot or very cold, and little moisture. For example, deserts are very hot and dry, and the Arctic is very cold and dry. Finally, here we can discuss climate change's effects on production. Climate change causes shifts in an area's usual temperature and precipitation patterns, and these changes can affect primary production in affected regions in various ways. This could either be a positive effect or a negative effect. For example, I have this figure here, climate change, wildfires, and insect outbreaks. Forests in the American Southwest are experiencing hotter droughts caused by rising temperatures in the summer and reduced snowfall in the winter. The drought stress index indicates how greatly trees are stressed by these conditions. Rising values of this index correspond to increasing drought. Higher drought stress correlates with increased area burned by wildfires and affected by bark beetles, which target drought-stressed trees with weakened defenses. This figure shows the correlation between the drought stress index levels and the area burned by wildfires, and this one shows the correlation between the drought stress index levels and area affected by bark beetles. Finally, we'll move on to talk about the efficiency of energy transfer between trophic levels, starting with defining secondary production. Secondary production refers to the new biomass produced within a consumer as a result of consuming chemical energy in the form of organic materials from the foods they eat. Furthermore, it is essential to note that not all of the food a consumer ingests is included in secondary production totals, because much of it passes through the consumer undigested, as well as some of the absorbed energy is being lost as heat and through respiration. Moving on to production efficiency. Whereas assimilation refers to the total amount of energy acquired from food that an organism uses for growth, respiration, and reproductive processes, production efficiency refers to the total amount of energy obtained from food that an organism uses in the formation of new biomass and reproduction, but does not include energy used for respiration. Furthermore, production efficiency can be calculated by finding the product of net secondary production multiplied by 100%, and then dividing that product by the assimilation of primary production. Finally, we'll talk about trophic efficiency. Whereas production efficiency focuses on the efficiency of energy flowing through a single organism, trophic efficiency is much more significant in scale and focuses on the flowing of energy between the trophic levels of an entire ecosystem. Furthermore, trophic efficiency can be depicted through the use of an energy pyramid diagram. Here I have figure 5510 from the textbook. It depicts an idealized pyramid of energy. This example assumes a trophic efficiency of 10% for each link in the food chain. Notice that primary producers convert only about 1% of the energy available to them to net primary production. So we start here with 1 million joules of sunlight. The primary producers convert that into 10,000 joules of energy. The primary consumers convert that to 1,000 joules of energy. The secondary consumers to 100 joules, and the tertiary consumers to 10 joules. Next, we'll talk about the cycling of nutrients and water within ecosystems. We'll start with nutrient cycling rates and decomposition. In areas where conditions permit decomposers to grow quickly and break down organic materials rapidly, the nutrient cycling rates of these ecosystems also increase, and the ecosystem's soil and detritus contain small percentages of its total organic materials. Conversely, in conditions that do not promote rapid growth and activity of decomposers, the opposite is true. The soil and detritus will contain higher percentages of its total organic materials because they will have a longer cycling period. Moving on to biogeochemical cycles. The term biogeochemical cycles encompasses the cycles on Earth in which both biotic and abiotic factors are involved, such as nutrient cycles. Furthermore, these cycles can occur on a global scale, such as the cycling of chemicals that are light enough to exist as gaseous forms in the Earth's atmosphere, or a local scale, such as cycles of chemicals that are heavy and are primarily carried short distances as parts of dust. This figure here depicts the water cycle on Earth, and provide some additional information over here, but I won't read that all to you. Finally, we can talk about restoration ecology, starting with bioremediation. Bioremediation refers to the processes by which humans employ living, well-adapted organisms to remove toxins from heavily polluted ecosystems through various means. For example, organisms that have adapted to life in soils that are highly concentrated with heavy metals can be deployed to absorb these heavy metals from a region's soil, and then the organisms can be removed from the ecosystem, thus ridding the ecosystem of large amounts of these materials. And finally, we have biological augmentation. Whereas bioremediation is the process of using living organisms to detoxify ecosystems by removing pollutants, biological augmentation refers to the processes through which humans use living organisms to introduce helpful materials into an ecosystem that is otherwise lacking them. For example, nitrogen-fixing plants can be planted in an ecosystem whose soil contains lower than adequate nitrogen concentrations to help improve those numbers. Finally, this figure depicts a gravel and clay mine site in New Jersey before and after restoration. Picture A was in 1991 and picture B was in 2010, so it's about 19 years. And that is all I have for today. Thank you so much for listening and have a great day.